Hello and welcome to another episode of the VoiceBox podcast. I am your host, Gabby Mendez, and today we are joined by the wonderful barrister and author, Christian Weaver. We're going to have a fantastic conversation with Christian. He is truly so knowledgeable in his field, and I can't wait for you guys to hear this. Christian, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Gabby.
So great to have you here. I've actually just listened to you on the VoiceBox stage. How was it? How was your experience?
I enjoyed it so much. And I think the power of VoiceBox, if I can just give a shout out to VoiceBox to start with, I think being in that room, the level of questions, the challenge, I've come out of that room a better person, and I will be a better barrister moving forward as a result of some of the perspectives I picked up in there. So I really enjoyed it.
You have been doing this for some time now. How long have you been in law for?
6 years now.
Okay. Because when I was listening to you when you were on stage, I was just thinking, you explain this so simply, but I've always felt that the law is really complicated. When did you realize that it was so important that you needed to put law in simple language for people like me and everyone else that might be listening to understand?
Absolutely. I remember there was a few years ago, I was living in London before the Law in 60 Seconds or anything like that. And you'll know how you have the news cycle and things will be prominent in the news at a certain time. And stop and search was a very big issue at that time. And stop and search disproportionately affects people that look like me. And I remember the Piers Morgan show and Piers Morgan talking about the importance of stop and search and how it needs to be increased. That was the big call, actually. We need to increase stop and search. And I realized that a lot of the people I know, family, friends, cousins, are going to be impacted by that. And I remember thinking, gosh, if that happens to them, and I know them all well, I know that they're not involved in criminality or whatnot, but they won't know what to do in that situation. And that concerned me. So as a result of that, I thought, okay, I want to record a video that explains the legal rights to my friends, to the people around me. Even I might need to know them, so it's a helpful recap for me. So I put the first video out. I called it The Law in 60 Seconds, the idea being that it would encourage people, because although it's about law, if they know it's only 60 seconds long, it can't be that long to read it or that long to listen to. But then it really picked up. And I remember being sat in my flat in London, in East London where I lived at the time, and people like adults, and I was quite young at that time, but adults were getting in touch saying, look, I'm experiencing X, Y, Z, some of the most devastating things in their life. And I was thinking, why do they feel like they need to come to me as a guy in my young 20s or whatever? And I realized it's because there isn't an alternative accessible resource out there that explains people's rights. And of course, it became something I got really passionate about because I thought, well, why is it that the law isn't taught in schools? And then who does that benefit? And I realized, well, actually, if the powers that be know the law and you don't, they can do whatever and you can't even stand up for yourself. So it led to what you might call a bit of a mission alongside my goal to be a barrister, and I've stuck with it since. And of course, it's since grown into a book and hopefully a movement.
It's amazing what you're building and growing, and I know there's lots more content to come on the way. I know you're planning a big project that's coming up soon as well, which will develop that kind of law in 60 seconds concept. Reflecting back, tell me about your childhood or family or a story that kind of first made you notice justice and inequality in your life. Was there a particular moment that springs to mind?
I think two. I think first is actually before I was even born. I was born in 1994, which is the year after Stephen Lawrence was brutally murdered, a black teenager in London. So the way I was raised as a child was very much post Stephen Lawrence. My parents weren't in any way overprotective. They didn't want to know where I was, especially when I got to the age where I was starting to go out more. And they always instilled in me what you might call a bit of a healthy skepticism, a healthy distrust, you might say, of authority, and in particular the police. And it was because in their memory, they had seen a young black guy who probably didn't look too dissimilar to me be murdered. And the police were later said they were institutionally racist. But these things all arose out of that case, a kid that looked just like me. So the way I was raised was a very post-Stephen Lawrence way to be raised. And then one of my earliest childhood memories, and I mentioned this in the introduction of both of my books because it was so formative, was my family from Nottingham, and my grandfather was facing these racist attacks whereby people would leave dog feces on his car. I remember one day he just put up a placard outside of the house and he said, this family will not be intimidated by racists. And at the time, it got a lot of press coverage. And my granddad was, or is, like a leader in the church, a local church. So as a result of that, there was quite a bit of support. And I remember at the time, it was a really early experience, but I remember being quite excited about it. But then as I got a bit older, I remember reflecting, why did my granddad feel he couldn't go to the police about an issue like that? And I remember thinking, well, and the incidents did stop, But I thought, would they have stopped if he didn't have the strength or know that he had the support behind him to put this sign up outside of his house? And then it also kind of started to introduce questions of, well, who polices the police? So if the police couldn't service there, what's that about? And who are they trying to help and whatnot? They were questions for a 6 or 10-year-old or whatever I was at the time. But yeah, I think from there, I saw justice firsthand. I saw the importance of people standing up for themselves. And that stayed with me ever since.
And do you think that's why you ended up going into law and becoming a barrister as well?
Yeah, and I think really specifically, not just law, but human rights law. There could have been many other things I could have done, but it was always going to have that human rights core to it. And I think as you develop and you start to figure out where your skills might lie and also the lifestyle that you want. So for me, it was important that I was self-employed so that I've got the freedom and flexibility to take on cases I'm passionate about and then rest when I need to as well. But yeah, being a barrister whereby you're arguing for something in court was something that aligned with my skill set, and I felt was the most effective way that I could push what I felt was important in society. And there are other people that maybe are brilliant writers and they choose the journalism path, but I felt for my skill set, it was being a barrister that I could use to advance what I cared about.
Absolutely. We've seen very recently in kind of arts and culture some quite big cases come to light on our TV screens, which I think is another great way for us to understand more about the law and human rights and so much of that. A really prime example of this is Mr. Bates versus the Post Office. Did you get to watch that?
I did.
I thought it was a fantastic series. I thought it was so inspiring, and it's led to so much progress and kind of change in that world because of the media attention. How important do you think it is that TV and film sheds a light on issues like that?
Absolutely. I've always found it so strange that as a lawyer, you go into these courtrooms and they're technically open to the public, but it's not something the public think to do, not least because they're too busy trying to make ends meet. But you go into these courtrooms, you hear some of the biggest tragedies, scandals, things in society. You'll fight for your client, the courtroom door closes. Unless there's press there, nobody else ever knows. And I always used to think, gosh, how bad would it be if all lawyers just treated their job as you go into court, you do your job, and then you go home? Because society would never hear about the things that we hear. Something I mentioned at the event earlier, but something that we as lawyers have is the ability to request disclosure. And that's when you can get documents from these otherwise really hard to access institutions about how a certain bad thing might have happened or how someone died. So yeah, it's really important that whether it's the press or whoever, report what goes on in there and explains it in a way that the public can actually understand. So I think, the show you just mentioned, I remember watching that and I even got emotional watching it. Actually It brought out the real emotion. But I think they're so important and I would love to see more of that. And I would love to see, other lawyers as well. And we are very busy, so it's not always easy, of course, but us actually talking to the public about the things we're seeing as well.
Is there any particular case, perhaps one that you've worked on, that you would love to see, get as much coverage as like Mr. Bates versus the Post Office?
There's a few cases I'm on now, so that the Southport inquiry and the COVID-19 inquiry, and I think pleasingly they do seem to be getting attention, and that's very important because so many things are coming out of those inquiries that urgently need review, and there will be recommendations that will come out of these inquiries at the end. And like we always see and say, in order for those recommendations to actually be put in force, there'll need to be public pressure. So the public need to know what's gone on. But I mean, even going back to Awabi Shak's case, I always think to myself, gosh, if the press just weren't there, or if it was maybe a lawyer that didn't maybe appreciate the importance of talking about this outside of court, to think that things wouldn't have changed as they did. And one case actually that I think I would love it if it had got a bit more attention, is the death of Exodus Ayub, who was, I mentioned him again, he was a boy that died in Leeds. He fell from a tower block window, and the prevalence of children, especially with autism, falling out of their tower block windows, often in older type accommodation where the windows don't have any form of real restriction, so they can just open out, it happens so frequently. I mean, I always say, wherever you live, if you just Google the words, your area and then tower block death, it's a very sad thing to have to do, but you'll often see that something like that's probably happened close to where you live. I wish there was more attention on that issue, and there are a number of cases I'm doing coming up where that issue will be explored, and I really hope there can be more attention on that, because that has to change. The issue's known now. It's just that before there's the political or the public push for a change, politicians won't act.
You mentioned it there, but Arab's Law is coming in. Tell us a little bit more about that story. Give us the backstory for anyone who's unfamiliar. Tell us a little bit more about that and what's going to change as a result of the inquiry.
Of course. So Awabishak was a 2-year-old boy who died due to prolonged exposure to mold in his home. Tragic. What made the case even more tragic, added layers to the tragedy, was the fact that the family had done everything right. They had complained so many times, they'd been ignored. It got to the space where they were just literally seeing their child pass away. And his coughing fits were so bad that they didn't want to take him out of the house. But then as a result of him staying in the house, it was causing his health to deteriorate even further. I always remember at the inquest, someone from Rochdale Borough Housing described the mold in the apartment as being like black slime going down the walls, and also admitted that the home was unfit for human habitation. And that really stuck with me. It's a legal term, unfit for human habitation. But I stepped back almost not as a lawyer, and I thought, how can it be the case that members of our society are living in a home, and then a baby and a pregnant mother, as Awab's mother was at the time, are living in a home that's unfit for humans to live in? So that was the case of Awabishak. And Awab's family, we brought all this evidence to light. Everything that happened, or certainly we believe, came out. And the coroner said this has to be a defining moment for the housing sector. And it was. The Manchester Evening News campaigned with us after, along with the support of Shelter. 180,000 people signed a petition calling for an Awab's Law. Awab's family didn't demand punishment or anything. They just demanded peace of mind to know that that couldn't happen to anybody else. Awab's inquest was in November 2022, so it's now nearly 3 years, but we've campaigned for those 3 years, and Awab's Law will come into force. And what that will mean is for those that live in social housing, if they identify an issue that could potentially be seriously harmful to health, within 10 days, the landlord must investigate the issue. Within 3 days, so 3 working days after that investigation, the landlord has to inform the tenant of what the issue is, and what's going to be done about it. And if the issue does pose a serious risk to health, then within 5 working days, then the landlord will have to deal with the issue, or repair the issue. So it's a massive step forward in terms of tenant protection. We're hopeful that not only will it give tenants increased power, but actually change the culture that exists between tenant and landlord. Some landlords do a brilliant job, and I would never want it to even seem like it's us versus them. I really wouldn't. But for those landlords that don't, and that are content or willing for their tenants to live in such poor conditions, we hope it can give tenants power, so landlords feel like, okay, that complaint's been made, and I actually know I have to do something about that, because otherwise that tenant has power to do something as part of the court process. And I would say the final thing, and it's something I always talk about, but the law can't just be PR. The law exists, but government shouldn't get ticks just for the law existing. The mark of a law being effective is the fact that real people, normal people, can actually use that law and benefit from that law. Because if they can't, and the powers that be, even if the law exists, can do what they want and literally know, this person might even intellectually know that we've broken the law, but what are they going to do about it? And I think that's just the breeding ground for such poor interactions between tenant and landlord, individual and state. So yeah, that's Awab's Law, and that's what it will do, and I really hope it can bring about a change.
Absolutely, I really hope so too. You mentioned right at the top of the podcast that your first video that you ever did was about stop and search. So I'd love to dive into that topic a little bit more.
Of course.
Has the law changed over the years? Does it, law is always updating itself. So when you are creating these videos, are you aware that things might change? I know you are constantly keeping on top of things and stuff. Has that changed over time? And if we were to talk about it today, is there a chance that there might be changes to that in the future?
Of course, the law is very regularly changing. It will be often in small parts, but then when you look over the course of a period, it can sometimes have changed quite significantly. Stop and search is a brilliant example. Stop and search at its core, is pretty much the same as it has been for quite a long time now. But I think where there's been quite a significant change is when it comes to stop and search in relation to protest matters. So the Public Order Act has introduced new protest offences, one of which, for example, is locking on. And locking on effectively is something that's sometimes done by protesters, and it's where you will almost connect yourself to whether it's a fence or some form of polling or rails that mean that it's hard for the police to remove you. Now, obviously a padlock is often used for that. And now, of course, as part of the police's stop and search powers, they can stop and search somebody that they suspect might be carrying an item that could be used for protest-related activity. Because locking on is included in that now, that means anybody there's reasonable suspicion they might be carrying a padlock. The police might say, carrying a padlock for protest activity. But also you could be carrying a padlock because you're going to the gym.
Exactly.
It relates to your job. And it just starts to create a situation, not starts actually, this has been going on for a while now, but it further adds fuel to the fire of a situation whereby it's a big overstep that the state now have in terms of the powers they have. And actually, a police officer's reasonable suspicion can now mean that a lot of different people can be stopped for no reason. And I think that creates a chilling effect. And I think that also toxifies, for want of a better word, but the relationship that individuals have with the state. It doesn't feel fair. So yeah, that's a way that stop and search powers have changed recently.
And in terms of stop and search, then, what is the law on it? Like, do I have to give my name? When do I? Can you film the police in these such scenarios? If they ask to see my phone, do I have to unlock it for them? What is the process? What did you share in that initial video that might be helpful to our listeners?
Of course. So when you're stopped by the police, the amount of emotions that you'll go through, the fear, the kind of chaos, potentially embarrassment if you're in some ways in public. So what I wanted to do is add structure to that situation. So you can ask good questions. And also, if the police officer, and again, like I say with all of these things, some police officers do absolutely brilliant work. Some don't. So let's say you're in an encounter with a police officer. If they can see that you know your legal rights, that in and of itself might impact the way that you're treated. And the acronym I always use is WILD-R. So the W stands for why. So the officer should tell you, and you can ask, why am I being searched? The I stands for identity. They should tell you their name, the station they're attached to. The L stands for law. You should know what law you're being searched under. The D stands for detained. They should be telling you, whether you're detained or not. And the R stands for receipt or record, which means that after that stop and search situation, you can request a record of the stop and search. And that, of course, means that if you find you're being stopped a lot and you're collecting lots of records in your home of stop and searches, you eventually can go to the police and say, look, this is evidence that something is just clearly wrong here. And in terms of your other questions, in terms of do you have to give your name, information, there's a difference between what's called a stop and account and a stop and search. So a police officer can at any time say, hey, stop, mate. Oh, in fact, to strip it back even further, they can say, hey, what's your name and what are you doing in this area? You don't have to give the police any information. There's no law that tells you have to give the police information in that situation, or certainly speaking generally anyway. Now, of course, you might give the police information to assist them, but if you don't, that's not against the law, and that's a really important starting point. Now, for a stop and search, laws do activate, if you like, and that situation can be different, but there is that difference between the two. So, for example, in a stop and account, you can just leave. The officer can ask you that question. You can turn your back and just go. Again, what a person chooses to do is their choice, but it's important to know what the law is so they can make an informed decision.
I think understanding what our rights are is such an important issue across so many different things, and you do such a good job of breaking it down into simple terms for people to understand. I love it. So we're moving to a new segment of the podcast, which is Teach Me in a Minute. I know there's a topic that you would love to teach us in 60 seconds. What's it going to be?
Self-defense.
Do you feel like you're sat on mastermind chair right now?
Yeah, I do.
This question.
Can I hear the music in the back?
No, we're going to play the music. No, but do tell us a little bit about self-defense then. We'll give you 60 seconds.
Self-defense. First key thing to know is that if you're in a situation where you feel somebody might attack you, you don't have to wait to be struck before you act. And that's called a preemptive strike. So you can hit first if you feel that a person might be about to attack you. That's really important because anybody that's done martial arts will tell you, sometimes whoever gets the first hit can dominate the fight. So if you're in a situation where you've done nothing wrong and you can tell somebody's about to attack you, the importance of getting the first hit and then getting out is not only a martial arts teacher will tell you makes sense, but actually in law is recognized as being an appropriate course of action potentially. Now, what's important is reasonableness. You can't in any way act in a way that is just wholly disproportionate to the situation, but the law recognizes that in a high emotion situation like that, you might not be able to weigh to a nicety the amount of force that's relevant. So as long as the amount of force you used, you genuinely thought was appropriate in that time, you will be fine from a legal standpoint. And that's about 60 seconds.
That was amazing. Well done.
Thank you. Right?
I love that. It's so interesting. And I think it's these sort of scenarios that, we hope that we would never find ourselves in, but we may need at some point in our lives.
Absolutely.
And so listening to, podcasts like this or watching, your content and things that you produce can actually save a life. It can change your life. Incidents like this can have massive impact. So knowing this stuff is just so, so important. Moving into the world of work and uni and kind of the working world, sometimes you might need the law to if you find yourself in a really difficult situation within a work environment. When you feel like something is wrong, what's the first thing that you should think about doing in regards to the law? Like perhaps you've been unfairly treated or there's been a scenario where you don't feel quite comfortable. What's the first course of action that you would think about?
If I was in that situation in an employment context, the ACAS website is actually a brilliant starting point. It's in no way comprehensive guide to the full law, but actually for a layperson and even for a lawyer, I think it's just a helpful starting point in pointing you in the right direction. Then from there, it can be the case, once you understand a little bit of the lay of the land of what your issue is, you can then investigate further. So it might mention a certain piece of law, then you can search that in Google, learn more about that law, read associated links. But I think the ACAS website is a fantastic starting point. I'd also say when it comes to whether it's employment, work or anything, I think very often the best place you can always act from is the place where if you can, get yourself back to a non-emotional state. So from there, you can often think in the most grounded way. And often you'll find that the research and speed at which you can research is best when you can get yourself back to that mind frame. It's not always easy.
No,
Sometimes it
easy.
might just not be possible. But I always give that advice where I can.
And should you alert your employer in that scenario, or do you think that the guidance on the ACAS website would tell you yes or no in each scenario?
I think it's very fact specific, and there'll be occasions where the ACAS website gives specific advice based on a particular issue that's arisen. I think as a general rule, if you can have an awareness of the law before you have a conversation, that often helps. And if you're already feeling that your employer perhaps has abused their power or not treated you fairly, there's perhaps more reason to do that, because the goodwill that might ordinarily exist in interactions where if maybe you get something wrong in law, the person will tell you, might not exist there. So I'd encourage a person, they've got the time, to do a bit of research on the law first, and then armed with that, have the conversation. And actually that probably has a higher risk of stopping the issue escalating further, because from a very early standpoint, the person appreciates, or your employer appreciates, okay, this person has an understanding of the law. I'm going to make sure I act accordingly and properly from now.
Absolutely. We've talked about work. We've talked about, protests and being in stop and search and stuff, but we haven't mentioned at all really the online element, which is becoming more and more prevalent in our lives and has such a big impact. I know the law is constantly changing, but if you suspect something has happened and it relates to something that has happened online, what are the typical steps that we need to be taking?
I always say that it's really important to have, that there's a distinction between, people say in real life and URL to refer to the online world, but in real life laws very much still apply to the URL world. So if it is the case that a person is receiving abuse online, although there will be mechanisms that exist with the social media company, the police can very much still deal with the issue as well. And the laws are fast evolving in this area to ensure that the law is keeping up with advancements in social media, but the police can deal with the issue. So as a result of that, and the fact that there might be a criminal law process that takes place as a result of what you're experiencing, evidence is key. So screenshots are so important. And the reality is that the standard used in criminal law is beyond reasonable doubt. So very often, and we see this in a lot of different types of cases, but unless a jury is sure beyond reasonable doubt that something happened, there won't be a conviction. So actually screenshots are in some ways the very best form of evidence. In some ways, and it's perhaps a conversation for another day, but the strength and weight that screenshots have might soon start to need to be reassessed, because with AI and the ability to edit things and they genuinely look genuine, that will definitely raise further questions. But yes, to answer your question, the police can very much deal with it. So in addition to going to the social media company, having evidence that can be passed over to the police is important.
And do you think, if you are someone that posts online, should you refrain from posting something that, should you continue as normal online, or should you take a step back whilst you're, things are being reported or you're having those conversations with the police? Like, what's typically the best course of action?
Yeah, I think it can be fact specific as well. I think if a person's experiencing abuse, harassment, again, these things happen URL, so online, but they have real life implications. So especially if it's hurting how the person feels about themselves, I would say take a break entirely, step away, because that then gives the best chances of, you being able to look after yourself, you take care of your well-being. And I think what we're seeing, I was reading about it. In fact, Adele, who I was just on the panel with, and of course it's her story to share, but in terms of what's public and why she wrote her book, a large part of that is because her sister passed away, potentially as a result of things she was seeing online. So I think online can be really, really dangerous. Real harms can exist. So if you're able to step away from it, of course, I'd certainly advise that.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge on that as well. We're coming to the end of the podcast, sadly, but I would love to ask you a question that we've developed and we feel is really important, because the VoiceBox podcast is all about understanding, different viewpoints, different beliefs and stuff like that. I think it would be really important if you could perhaps share with us a belief that you've maybe always had or always felt, but has perhaps recently changed. Perhaps you've got a new outlook on something. You said even earlier, actually, that you felt changed by just speaking on the VoiceBox stage, from hearing from other people's experiences and stuff. It might be from that, or it might be from something else recently that you've experienced, but a change in your belief around something, because I think it's really important that we have that open mindset and the ability to change our opinions and what we know about the world and be constantly learning.
I think as a overarching principle, I'm much more open-minded than I have been previously. I'll literally listen now to any viewpoint and then take the time to assess it, but there's nothing that's off the cards for me. I will always listen to a viewpoint and then come to my own decision. And the first thing that came to mind is actually something I knew, but I really try and practice it now. And I remember when I used to, even if you were to Google the word justice, you would see pictures of a courtroom and like just a court setting. But the reality is, I don't feel anymore that justice happens exclusively in a courtroom. I think the courtroom plays an important part. Then it's when you step out of that courtroom and you're in society generally, real justice often comes about from what people outside of the courtroom do, not what a judge or a coroner says. So something I knew before, but I think it's really important. Even I push that bit more now that I really understand that fact.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for spending the time with us today. What can we see in your future? What are you hoping to do? Like, what are your plans in terms of carrying on your message that you've written 2 books now, but what do you hope to do in the future?
So The Law in 60 Seconds as a book was what was then turned off. Forgive me, it started off as a YouTube channel where I was uploading a lot of videos, and it was then turned into a book. Those videos are going to be coming back. So that's important to me, because while the education system isn't teaching people of their legal rights, I don't think it doesn't make sense for me to just sit back and accept that as the reality, when actually there might be information that I can put out that, while the government gets its act together, can fill that gap. So the Law in 60 Seconds YouTube videos are going to be coming back. Hopefully they're going to be a resource that anybody can turn to in their moment of need. And especially given the points I've spoken about and where our justice system isn't quite perfect, hopefully it will mean that for some people, matters won't need to progress to the justice system, because their awareness of their rights can help deal with the matter beforehand.
And just one last takeaway, if someone is struggling with something right now that they feel they need to understand the law better, what's their first course of action? What would you advise them to do? What's the key takeaway from this podcast, do you think?
Genuinely, I would actually say get a copy of The Law in 60 Seconds, because it was designed specifically for that purpose. And I've tried to write it in a way that it's in no way judgmental. So whatever the issue might be, whether it's relating to drugs and alcohol, there's no judgment. And I would want a person to feel they can turn to that. And it's a small book. It's called A Pocket Guide to Your Rights. But in the same way I spoke about the ACAS website and how it can point you in the right direction, I feel that The Law in 60 Seconds, or certainly its intention, is to be able to do the same thing. So that's what I would advise.
Well, thank you so much, Christian. It's so wonderful to chat to you today. Thank you so much, listeners, for tuning into another episode of VoiceBox. We will be back again soon in your ears. And if you haven't already, please do go and check us out on social media as well. Thank you so much for listening.